The honourable member Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour and privilege to rise today to speak to Bill C-56, an act to amend the Excise Tax Act and the Competition Act. And Madam Speaker, we know that this bill calls for two important aspects: to remove the GST from construction costs on new rental units, to enable the Competition Bureau to conduct better investigations while also removing efficiencies, exemptions during mergers to improve competition. Now, this is, in terms of the first part, Madam Speaker, in terms of the removal of the GST, it's something that New Democrats have been calling for, but it won't meaningfully reduce rent payments or create social and cooperative housing effectively. And this is something that we absolutely need, but this is part of a bigger comprehensive approach that we want to take and move forward to actually address the affordable housing crisis in our country. And in terms of the Competition Act, this bill is a start at reining in and regulating monopolies, but it doesn't go far enough to support Canadians in terms of their desire to control these monopolies and the impact they're having on our economy. And so we know, Madam Speaker, that in 8 years the Liberal government's been in power. They've been promising help. It's actually New Democrats that have been bringing forward solutions to get people help, like this GST removal on housing, although it doesn't go far enough and it doesn't have enough restrictions, but also dealing with competition, Madam Speaker. So I'm going to speak about a couple of things, because we know this is a little too late in terms of the housing crisis, but I'll speak to the housing crisis first, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, when we look at the impact of housing, and I am the critic federally for the NDP for mental health and substance use, we know that the cost of housing escalating at the pace it is, the lack of affordable housing and the occupancy rates that are at historic lows, available occupancy rates are at historic lows, that this is having a huge impact on people's mental health and stress levels, Madam Speaker. And this is a long-standing issue, since we know that the NDP, when there was a minority government in 1972, worked with the Liberals to create the National Housing Strategy, which developed 18 to 25,000 units a year, Madam Speaker, right to 1992. In fact, I'm one of the many Canadians that grew up in co-op housing, so I'm a beneficiary of co-op housing. And I saw firsthand and lived firsthand the experience of having safe, secure housing for my family and my parents, and saw what that can do. In fact, I can go back to that co-op today, and I can see many of the people I grew up with living in that co-op, their kids and their grandkids living there as well. But when they pulled out of that National Housing Strategy in the early 90s, the Liberals, both Conservatives and Liberal governments consecutively failed to dive back in. So as a result, Madam Speaker, we've lost between 18 and 25,000 units a year for over 30 years. And now our non-market housing availability in this country is at 3.5%. And you don't have to look far to see what 3.5% looks like, Madam Speaker. You can go outside the doors of the House of Commons, you'll see homeless people. You can go to Port-Alberni, in a medium-sized city, like in my riding, or a small city in my riding, you'll see homelessness. You can go to any big city and you'll see homeless people everywhere. Whereas, Madam Speaker, you can go to Europe and you can go to places like the Netherlands, where they're at 35% non-market housing. Vienna, 60%. And you will not see the scale of homelessness that we're seeing in our country. And we know it's so much more expensive to not provide people housing. The cost to hospitals, the cost to all of our systems eventually could impact our prison system. As we know, we just had Ben Perrin, the former public safety advisor for the Stephen Harper Conservatives. Just the other night, I hosted an event where he put out a new book called Indictment and a reform of Canada's justice system, Madam Speaker. And he talked about the lowest approach is to actually put people in proper housing. It's a fraction of the cost of what it costs if we don't, in terms of the prison system, hospital system, and healthcare system. So, Madam Speaker, we need to get back into affordable housing. Now, something we keep hearing about from the Conservative Party is that we need to, we heard the leader of the Conservative Party talk about, divesting and selling off 6,000 government buildings and divesting of 15% of public lands. But, Madam Speaker, I'll tell you what that looks like. We just saw what happened with Conservatives in Doug Ford in Ontario. It looks like profiteer and profits for developers. In fact, a handful of developers would have made $8.3 billion, Madam Speaker, almost overnight. Donors of the Doug Ford government. This is what it looks like. when Conservatives divest public lands. Public lands belong in public hands, not in developers' pockets, Madam Speaker. That's where they belong. And Madam Speaker, we saw in BC, the BC Liberals, who've now rebranded themselves as BC United, they did the same thing, Madam Speaker. They sold off $493 million of public lands to the private sector, to donors of their party, and that attributed to worth $860 million just a couple of years later, Madam Speaker. So these conservative ideas of selling off public lands end up in developers' pockets, Madam Speaker. We need to fix it. We need to actually fix this, and I'm bringing forward a plan to do that, Madam Speaker. We know we need 3.5 million homes just to meet the demand by 2030. This is going to take a wartime-like effort to do that. We actually have to work together in this House if we're going to achieve it. We've got to remove barriers, and we need to provide guidelines and regulations so we don't have another green belt, so we don't have another scam like we saw in British Columbia when the Conservatives and the right wing get into government. We need to make sure that there's a regime put in place. I put forward a motion, a Government and Operations Committee, to do just that, Madam Speaker, to look at selling or leasing, and we should not ever sell public lands, Madam Speaker. That should never, ever happen. We should only lease public lands. Public lands belong in public hands, and I can't say that enough. And if we do lease or use government buildings, it should be done with free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples whose lands we live and work and reside on. Has to be done, Madam Speaker. And also, they're the most impacted when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to overcrowded of housing and housing needs in our country. So they have to be part of the conversation. They cannot be left out. But I urge all of us to work together to provide regulations so we never see a Greenbelt style divestation of housing in this country and government lands, because that's not going to create affordable housing. That's not going to solve the housing crisis in this country, Madam Speaker. We heard from Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, and this is regarding this bill, which lacks a lot. She cites that, I thought we were worried about affordability for tenants, not developers. Average rents in Canada are now more than $2,000 a month. If the GST is going to make a difference, it must be conditional on building affordable units, public value for public dollars. I want to thank her for that comment, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, when I talk about 3.5% of our housing is in non-market housing right now, over 30% this year now is in corporate interest in the REITs, Madam Speaker, where we've seen corporatization buy up a large amount of our residential housing stock. That needs to stop. We need to get to the opposite. It should be 30% non-market housing and 3.5% corporate housing. That's the problem. It's got to get flipped on its head. Madam Speaker, I'll speak quickly because I see I've only got a couple minutes left around the Competition Act. Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro had $3.6 billion in profits, and that went in the pockets of the owners. Madam Speaker, my co-op in my town, Tofino, they had $12 million in sales in grocery, $16 million at the gas bar, $28 million in overall sales. They gave back a 5.5% dividend to their members, actually 5%, because they kept 0.5% for capital costs, Madam Speaker, even in improved services. What we need to do is make sure we have an excess profit tax on these excess profits for grocery store owners and use some of that profit to support models like the co-op model. Because we know that 5.5% went back into the hands of the people in my community, but the private sector, that money went in the pocket of people like Galen Weston. And that needs to be discouraged, and we need to find a better way forward. Now, we hear the Conservatives talk about the impact of the carbon tax. Madam Speaker, it's 0.15% of inflation, according to the Government of Canada. 8 in 10 families get it back. What they don't want to talk about is they're actually fighting for the 2 in 10. It's a diversion tactic, Madam Speaker. They don't want to talk about who they're really fighting for. And the other thing, Madam Speaker, is if we don't do anything and put a price on carbon, then it's shouldered by the 8 in 10 and all Canadians. And if we do nothing, then there'll be a carbon adjustment at the border, and they don't want to talk about that. That would cripple industry in our country. But the truth is, Madam Speaker, grocery store prices have had a 56 times increase than the carbon tax impact on food and services, and 26 times in terms of the corporate greed and the profit that happens in our country when it comes to grocery stores. So I want to put things in perspective, and I want to thank you, Madam Speaker, for the chance to speak on this bill.
And comments, the honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Thanks, Madam Speaker, and I really appreciate the speech that my friend and colleague has provided here this morning. I don't agree with his comments in terms of demonizing the private sector, because I think the private sector is going to be an important partner with us to get us out of this housing crisis. But I also don't agree with the Leader of the Opposition when it comes to demonizing municipalities. And I think my friend and colleague talked about working with municipalities to build the non-market housing supply. And unlike the Leader of the Opposition, who's demonized small-town mayors and municipal councils, we've worked with municipalities. Our Housing Accelerator Fund is one example of that. So my question through you to my friend and colleague would be, why is it important to work with municipalities rather than making them out to be the demons as part of our housing crisis that we have today?
Honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, let's face it, Madam Speaker, Liberals and Conservatives' free market developer-style model hasn't worked. I sat in local government. And if they actually put money on the table for non-market housing, that would get gobbled up in a heartbeat. They want to be partners, Madam Speaker, but they don't have the resources. They've been downloaded on and downloaded on since 1992 by Conservatives and Liberals consecutively. They need resources, Madam Speaker, for non-market housing. They will deliver. They will work with the private sector. There is an opportunity to work together, but it doesn't mean giving up public lands. It means that we can work together and leasing out projects, working with the development community in that way. But the current method of Liberal and Conservative policy, when it comes to the developer-driven model, isn't going to work. It's never worked anywhere around the world that an affordable housing crisis has been solved by the private sector and a free market approach.
And comments, the honourable member for Chatham-Kent-Leamington. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate my honourable colleagues' raising of grocery costs. Let's put some things on the record here. The day after the photo op with the 5 retailers, the retailers decreed to their suppliers, starting with the largest one, and the second one's followed suit, that they'll accept no price increases from their suppliers for the next 12 months. The PBO's analysis of the carbon tax is not specific around food inflation. It's a general analysis. Food production is energy intensive. So, and if this honourable colleague were to convince his government partners to put a profits tax that would take the entire retail profit into the form of a tax into government coffers, that would lower the cost of groceries from a $25 SAT to $24, 4%. So the question specifically I have to my colleague is, with carbon tax being applied to the farmer, to the trucker, to every step of the process, with retailers saying they will not absorb it, there's no price increases, who should pay that carbon tax? Is it the farmer, the supplier to the farmer, the trucker, the distributor? I would ask who would be paying that.
Honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Madam Speaker, the Governor of the Bank of Canada said the impact on the carbon tax is 0.15% of inflation. But when we look at oil and gas, who are having record profits, these big grocery stores, record profits, big banks, record profits. We can look at other countries like Britain, where the Conservatives are in government, by the way, and they have an excess profit tax on oil and gas. We can't even get Liberals in Canada to do that, Madam Speaker, never mind Conservatives, who we don't need lobbyists for oil and gas, Madam Speaker, here on the Hill, because they are the lobbyists for oil and gas. And that's the truth, Madam Speaker. It's a diversion. The reality is, Madam Speaker, we need excess profits on these industries that are runaway, causing inflation and really harming Canadians every day with the costs that are being downloaded on top of them. And we really need to have an honest conversation, not this diversion method of deterrence. Yeah.
A brief question. The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's speech and his plea in favour of off-market housing. But we have a structural problem. In Quebec alone, we need 1.1 million housing units by 2030. And that's maximum capacity of, if all resources were mobilized, they could only build 80,000 new units, but we need 1.1 million. That's not the stats for all of Canada, but the scale, it's roughly the same proportionately. So in Quebec, we have an acquisition fund We're going to have to find other solutions. Does my colleague have any other solutions to propose?
Again, I really appreciate the comment, and I think we're both on the same page that we need a wartime-like effort. We need to use every tool in the toolbox, Madam Speaker, to deal with this. Right now, the government doesn't have a plan. They have no plan on how they're going to build 3.5 million homes. And this is what we need to do in this chamber, is have that conversation, bring forward ideas. Like I said, let's use some public land, but let's keep it in public hands. Leasing, working with the private sector to ensure that we can build affordable non-market housing. But this free market approach will not work, Madam Speaker. It hasn't worked anywhere in the world to solve an affordable housing crisis. It's not going to start working now. So I want to work with my colleague because we need a plan. And this government, right now, it's a rudderless ship, Madam Speaker. This is low-hanging fruit, removing the GST on rental housing. And so I want to thank the colleague for the question.